So, after watching this movie, one thing went through my head. How can a movie just start off so well and then end up not so good in the end? Hey guys, it's Kevin again, and this is going to be another classic horror movie review for, Halloween movie reviews for my Halloween movie reviews for you guys. And this time I'm going to be reviewing a very popular mini-series. It's actually a mini-series slash movie. Um, and that is the 1990 psychological horror drama mini-series classic, It. It is a movie that I have always really wanted to see. I've heard so many good things about it. I've heard a lot of things, a lot of really great things about it. I've heard so many people say a lot of amazing things about this movie, and I was really looking forward to this movie. Now, especially because of Twisty on American Horror Story, who is getting compared to it, the clown or Pennywise, whatever you want to call him. So, I watched the movie. It's 3 hours long. That's why this review is, so late. I would be watching Once Upon a Time right now, but this review's up really late. That's why I'm not live tweeting Once Upon a Time tonight, just so you guys know. But I finally finished it, and overall, what did I think of it? Part 1 is amazing. Part 1 is just amazing. I loved it. Part 2, I have a lot of problems with, and we're gonna get to that. But let's just get to what it is about. Basically, Part 1 of it is about this interdimensional predatory life form, which has the ability to transform into basically um, the person, whoever it wants to go after its prey's worst fears, allowing most times it is in the form of this dancing clown Pennywise, and the protagonists we have are the people, all these are these people called the Losers Club. They are a group of outcast kids who discover Pennywise and vow to destroy him by any means necessary. And the first part is basically them meeting him, and it's years later. And basically, what ends up happening is, years later, there's like this murder that happens. This little girl, and they all are starting to remember when they first met this dancing clown. Part 2, and that's basically the plot of Part 1. We see, each of them meeting, and we see them form this, group. And Part 2, basically, part 2 is about, how they all come back together for the reunion, to basically stop him. Basically, that they all come back together, to stop him when they start to suspect that he's returned, and that's basically what part 2 is about. Now, I just explained in a very bad way, but that's pretty much what the movie's about, and now I'll say this about the movie. This is a mini series, so for a mini series, you expect one part to not be good and the other part to not be as good. And I will say for a mini series, this is a very good mini series, but there are a lot of problems in part 2. Let's just get to the acting in this. Now, the first thing about the acting is most of the acting in the first part are from the kids. All the kids were fantastic. I thought all the kids were fantastic actors and fantastic actresses. I have no problems with them. I thought they were all fantastic and they were all very well casted, in my opinion. I had no issues with them. Now, let's talk about our main stars here. The main star here is Tim Curry as Pennywise. Holy shit, this guy steals the show. Steals the show. He is hilarious. He has so many hilarious lines. He has everything a good villain should, except for one thing that I do have to complain about. He has a lot of things, definitely, that I really like about him. One, he's awesome. He is just such an awesome. He has the perfect voice for this character. Hi, Georgie. Like, that's just the perfect voice he has. And there's, so much about him that I love about his character. And there are just so many great things about his character that I love. And my only issue with his character is that we don't really know. You know how with a lot of villains, in my opinion, a good villain, we need to know why they're doing this, what their motive is. Because every villain who does something, every sort of antagonist, whether they're a vigilante killer or a serial killer or whatever they are, they each have a motive. It doesn't have a motive. We never find out what Pennywise's motive is. We just don't ever find out. So, in my opinion, that was definitely a problem for me, because whenever you have a good villain, you need to have some sort of motive, and Pennywise really does not have any sort of motive. We don't really know why he's doing this. They don't really explain it, and that was a problem for me, definitely, that I had with this movie. I wish that the movie would have been a little bit more, The movie doesn't show him a lot in part 1, which I like that it doesn't show him as much, they more talk about him, but part 2, they start to use him way too much. Part 2, they change everything, and everything that worked in part 1, they completely changed part 2, which I'll talk about, but Richard Thomas as Bill, I thought he was great. He is a great character. His basically the plot with his character that his brother is killed. Georgie. He was the first victim of Pennywise, and he was the first one to see Pennywise. Then you have John Ritter as Ben, who I loved his character. I thought he was great, definitely. Annette O'Toole as Beverly. She I thought was definitely very, very good in my opinion. I thought she was probably the third best. Also another thing, Richard Thomas. I didn't like him in the beginning as much, but the second part I actually liked him more. Like he was one of the few actors that their acting got better as the movie went on. I thought he definitely got better in my opinion. At first I didn't like his acting, but then I did. Harry Anderson as Richie, I thought his character was great. He's sort of the character that's like, let's just forget that Pennywise is alive. Let's just get out of here. That sort of thing. I thought his character was definitely very well done. And, there are other characters to talk about, but that's pretty much everyone I think I'm going to talk about right now. Let's get to the directing of this movie. The directing for part 1. The thing is, there are 2 directors for this movie. 2 directors. And there are 2 writers for this movie as well. So that's why this movie it feels like it's 2 different movies. That's why this movie is in 2 different parts. Because here's the thing with this movie. The directing to the first half of the movie is fantastic. I think the directing is fantastic. I love the way it's done. I love that basically part 1 is us seeing them meeting it. Basically us seeing them meet him. And, them basically getting introduced to their characters. Then seeing how they met them. And then seeing them form this group and everything. Take down the bullies. I thought that was very well done. I thought part 1 was very well done. Part 2 ended up being very choppy. There were a lot of parts that could have been cut out. I thought part 2 was way too long. Way too long. I was not into part 2 very much at all, guys. I'm going to be honest. I was not that into part 2. I really was not. And I'll talk about why I was not into part 2, but I was not into it very much at all. Part 2 was like 2.5 hours. I was not into it at all, and part 1 was just so much better in my opinion. Part 1 is legitimately scary. The scares in this movie are fantastic. Like, the part 1 has some very good scares. There's one that is just so scary. It involves a hand out of a book. I'm not going to explain what it is, but it is very well done. It is very creepy, and I thought that scare was definitely very good in my opinion. I thought that was very well done. The cinematography of this movie is brilliant. Great cinematography. Like, the effects for Pennywise was great. All the effects were great. I love the effects. Nothing wrong there. Editing really had a lot of problems. So, let's get to those problems for it. I'm also going to analyze it, but let's get to some problems with it. First of all, this movie has a lot of problems in part 2. First of all, in part 1, we have a great cliffhanger. I love the way part 1 ends. Stan, if you guys have not seen it, do not watch the rest of this review because I'm going to spoil the entire part 2 and everything that's wrong with it. And after you've seen it, come back and let me know if you guys agree with me. So, of course, at the end of part 1, Stan ends up killing himself. And he writes the word "in" on the bathroom blood wall with his blood. And it's handled horribly in part 2. We come back and everyone's just like, okay, he's dead. It's back. They don't really care that he's back. And that's a huge problem for me. My other thing with this movie is that the way that Pennywise decides to come back to Derry, the way that he comes back, it's laughable. There is a montage, and I'm not kidding, there's a montage of Bill and Mike on a bicycle with this, like, happy song, and then he experiences some sort of memory, and that was horribly done. I'm gonna talk about that twist, but that was horribly done, and there's so many filler stuff in this movie. There's a montage of them eating, it's just like, I was not a fan of that at all. Not a fan at all. I did not like that. I was not a fan of that. And the other thing to talk about with this movie that I was not a fan of, like, I was definitely not a fan of that. I did not like that. Hang on one second. So getting back to my problems with the movie, as I said, that was handled horribly in my opinion, and we find out a twist of why he experiences that bicycle memory, which was just terrible. The other thing is there are so many scenes of them just talking about their lives, and that's fine, but part 1 was so sinister. We already know about their lives. We saw all of that in part 1. Part 2 should be the aftermath, seeing them react to this death, seeing them want to fight against it. And that really doesn't come in to till the last like 40 minutes of this movie, and that is a huge problem for me. This movie just part 2 just dragged on and on and on. The editing was awful in part 2. I was not at all into in part 2. I didn't even like pay that much attention to part 2. Now, I will admit there were some things that I did like. For example, I liked how Ben's character thought that Pennywise, basically, he didn't know the difference between it and a human. I thought that was very well done. There's that scene, of course, where he's talking to Beverly, and I knew they were going to get together, first of all, because the movie told you that from the beginning. So that was not very well done either, in my opinion. And that I had a lot of problems with that, definitely. But let's get to the worst part of this movie. The worst part, in my opinion. So Audra goes catatonic. Bill's wife goes completely catatonic and everything. And basically, oh, also, one other thing. The way they react to Pennywise, the way they react is not scary at all. The way that Pennywise just, appears. Okay, the library one is kind of scary, the one where he fills the blood with balloons, but honestly, when Pennywise scares them in the first part, it honestly feels like a bad comedy. It really does. It is actually funny what's going on there. I could not take part 2 seriously after that. I really couldn't. When he had those blood balloons, I'm like, okay, I cannot take this movie seriously anymore. I just couldn't. I couldn't. I wanted to, but I could not take this movie seriously for the life of me. I couldn't. I'm sorry, guys, but I could not take this movie seriously. So, the other thing with this movie that I must say is the ending of the movie. Of course, Audra goes catatonic and everything. And basically, we find out what the whole bicycle thing is about. Bill took Mike on a bicycle when he was, catatonic, and basically coaxed him back to life. So this brings Audra back to life, and happy ending. That was a terrible ending, in my opinion. Terrible ending. I thought the ending was so bad. So bad, guys. I was not a fan of the ending at all, definitely. So, really, I was not a fan of the ending at all. So, really, you guys can see why part 2 has a lot of problems. I haven't even gotten to, the worst part in part 2. There's another thing. The worst part in part 2 is when we find out that Pennywise is actually a massive, hideous, spider-like creature. That is absolutely ridiculous. I actually had this really good theory about Pennywise in part 1, and that completely changed my opinion of it. After that, I'm like, I'm done. I am completely done with this movie. The way they kill him is absolutely ridiculous. First of all, Beverly kills him with a slingshot. They then, stab him to death. That was just ridiculous. I could not take the movie seriously anymore. And it was ridiculous. Really, it was absolutely ridiculous. I wasn't into the movie anymore after that. I wasn't. The movie had already lost me, but it got worse after that had happened. Definitely. It got worse, in my opinion. I was not a fan of that at all. Not a fan. That was just alright, that's my last straw. I'm done. I'm done. So, part 1 of the movie, I would probably give a solid 4.5, 4 out of 5. I thought it was really good. My only problem, of course, was Pennywise. Part 2, 2 out of 5. I mean, really, this movie had a lot of problems in part 2, definitely. I'd like to think part 2 didn't exist, but the thing is, you need part 2 because of the way part 1 ends. You can't just have part 1 end with him killing himself. It doesn't make sense if it does that. The other thing to talk about with this movie, is basically that, with this movie, the other thing to talk about is we have to analyze something. Now, I wanted to analyze this. Sorry, guys, I'm just tweeting something about Once Upon a Time. Yeah, I'm watching Once Upon a Time in the background, guys. But I want to talk about something about it that I thought was definitely a very good theory, but then they completely changed it. But I still kind of stick by it. So if you remember the very first scene with Georgie, it tells Georgie we're not strangers anymore, and Georgie says, I can't talk to strangers. I really feel that since each one of Stephen King's stories has to do with some kind of lesson, or teach you some kind of lesson, I really feel that every single one of his theories, that every single one of, the people that Pennywise killed, I really feel that this is supposed to teach kids why they should not talk to strangers. Now, I think you guys are probably saying, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. It really makes sense if you think about it. Think about it. Each time they talked to him, he was a stranger. He was not someone they really recognized, and he pretty much this all started because Georgie talked to a stranger, and he's gonna target the other ones. So definitely, it really shows why kids should not talk to strangers. Part two, they completely abandoned that, but I kind of still stick by that theory, in my opinion. I still stick by it. So that's personally how I feel about this movie. That's personally how I feel about it. But overall, guys, it is a movie that could have been really, really good. I really loved it in the first part. I know it was really, really good in the first part, and I know a lot of people love the first part because it was genuinely scary. Part two was just too melodramatic. That's the other thing in part two. Part two is way too melodramatic. Way too melodramatic. Part two has so many emotional scenes and so much emotion in it, and part one had that, but it did it in a smart way. Part two is just like emotional scene after emotional scene after emotional scene after emotional scene. It's just way too many emotional scenes. And then 40 minutes of the movie, oh, we gotta kill Pennywise. It's like 40 minutes into the movie, and it's like 40 minutes, the last 40 minutes of the movie, and it just is so stupid, in my opinion, and it really ruined the movie for me, and unfortunately, while I would love to say it is a classic, in my opinion, it is definitely very much, I agree with everyone says that part one is really good, but part two, in my opinion, I just do not want to talk about it. I do not like part two. I'm not a fan of it. I don't like it. I don't like the directions they took with it. And in my opinion, it just sucked. But that's it for my review of it. Let me know what you guys thought of this movie. Overall, I personally thought this movie could have been really good, and it wasn't. I'll see you guys in my next video, which will be my review for the season premiere of The Walking Dead, which I'm really looking forward to reviewing. Again, let me know what you guys think of this movie. What do you think of part one, part two? Do you think that part two really ruined a lot of things? I think part two ruined way too much. First of all, the ending was way too happy in part two. I was not a fan of that. Did you like what do you have the same complaint over Pennywise? It doesn't really have any motives. I think that's definitely is a problem, in my opinion. Do you think the editing definitely could have been cut down? Part 1, I didn't think the editing should have been cut down at all. Part 1 was perfect. Part 2, the editing definitely needs to be cut down a lot. That's it for my review. Hope you guys enjoyed. See you guys in my next video. Okay, bye.